It's Sunday, November 13th, and you're listening to the Beer Temple Podcast.
Remember, this is what we wanted. Remember, this is what we said. To never be heard or seen from again. Remember, this is what we wanted. Remember, this is what we said. To never be heard or seen from again.
Yep.
Oh, hello.
Yes.
Welcome to the Beer Temple Podcast.
Hello. I liked it. That had like the old infomercial thing where the person like is at their desk working and looks
see
up.
you there.
Oh, hello. I bet you had some questions about your financial future, like one of those deals.
And we're here to answer them.
Yeah. What's up,
No,
man?
it would be the last place to go for that information.
Yeah, most information.
Yeah. I'm good, man. How are you?
I've been seeing you a lot
Yeah, I'm sorry.
in this setting with headphones and mics in front of us.
Yeah. 4 times in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
It's going to be again on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fun. I
Good
mean,
times.
they've been good. I think
Good
we've put
shows.
out some good shows. This is a show that we're doing today that I have, when we first relaunched the show and we were thinking of what we could do, this was these hot take histories were one of the ideas I'd had, like, I want to do something, or let's do some stuff, you and I, other than just the round table, right? Let's kind of sprinkle those in. And this was the first one I wanted to do, and it's taken probably the better part of a year to actually get to do it.
Great art takes time, and this
Yes.
podcast is certainly great art.
Yes, I might have had to twist some arms to get to the people here. They may not have realized it, but I wasn't going to stop. I was like, no, you are the two I think should be on the show, and
Yeah.
you're gonna be on whether you realize it or not.
And they're like real human beings with normal people jobs, and they couldn't just be like, come hang out until 1 a.m. on a Tuesday.
Yeah, well, they're Lambic obsessed, so I don't know how much of normal human beings any of us are.
Sure,
but
fair.
close enough.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we're doing. Is this the 4th or 5th hot take history?
If I were to give a number, that would be a hot take. I haven't been tracking
Right.
this closely. But we did
Saison.
We did
Pumpkin and Oktoberfest.
Yep.
We did Saison. Saison. You already said. Stout.
We did Pale
Christmas
Ale,
beer
right?
and Pale Ale. So this is the 6th.
But Christmas beer hasn't. This will probably come out before Christmas beer, though, right?
True.
Yeah. So spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. Yeah. So I'm excited. These are some of my favorite episodes personally, because this just tickles the beer geek in me. I love kind of talking about like the origins.
Pastry sour.
Yeah, pastry sour. Spontaneous pastry beer, which is where
We
it's
got
all.
the 2 world's foremost experts in pastry sour.
Yeah, well, isn't that where everything is coming? Everything kind of comes together, right? So we're going to have spontaneous pastry sour soon. So
Sign up for it.
yes, well, see, now it's
This
recording.
is our gotcha journalism.
Yeah, this is how we do it.
It's art.
And we have a noted spontaneous pastry beer historian here again. We'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, so we're going to be doing Lambic, and boy, a lot of history on this one. And this was the episode where I know it's hot take history. So I want to say, certainly this stuff is not like peer reviewed. This is just us talking about the stuff that we know, and I brought in experts, and we do have a legitimate beer historian as well. But even so, I was nervous. I would not do this one on my own. I needed to have people who knew a lot more about it than I did
Sure.
on this one. So I think should we get right into it then?
Let's jump in.
All right, let's. We have a panel, so this is our first Hot Take History panel ever. And first, we will introduce them in order of seniority. That's how we always introduce guests.
But seniority being the amount of times they've been on the show.
I don't know of any type of seniority that matters to me.
Good point.
Yeah, it's the only type of seniority I care about. And do you want to introduce our first guest? And that's not just because I've just realized I don't want to butcher any pronunciations again.
I'll probably butcher the pronunciation too. He's your favorite beer historian that's ever been on this show.
Yes.
Phoning in from...
Well, Ron Pattinson's been on too.
Oh,
so
that's
don't.
true. Okay,
come on.
sorry.
One of the
one of the best beer historians that's ever been on the show.
I love Ron Pattinson, by the way. He's great.
Yeah,
Yes.
he's wonderful. Coming from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, Roel, will you pronounce your last name so I don't butcher it?
Well, my name is Roel Mulder. That's how you pronounce the whole thing. There was this American TV show once called X-Files. Mm-hmm. It had a guy in it called Fox Mulder, which is the same name.
Okay.
Same last name.
Got it.
Do you want to believe? Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, thanks for coming back on. After coming on for the first time to do the farmhouse episode, and it's always nice when we have people on and then they agree to come back a second time. That always says something. So I really
always
do.
Surprising.
Yeah, I appreciate it very much. Yeah, so thank you. Oh, absolutely. So looking forward to it. And then, Mike, we have two first-time guests. Mm-hmm. These are personal friends of mine, and I'm going to break my rule a little bit. I think this is maybe the first time ever in 250 some odd shows that I've broken this rule. So it's special.
I break it every time you're not around.
Oh, okay. That's true. But I've broken the rule. Yeah. So two friends of mine who are... without question for me, Lambic experts. I'm going to introduce them in no particular order, but I'll start from my left. We have Matt Granstrom. I won't say of Lambic.info, but I guess I just did. So how are you, Matt? Thanks for coming on the show.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, and just talk as close as you can into that mic. Yeah, thank you. Matt is a very soft-spoken individual, which is okay, but he carries a big stick. And
nice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Matt, what do you do for Lambic.info? And what is Lambic.info? Maybe we could start there.
It's an educational website, sort of repository of information about Lambic. I just do kind of behind-the-scenes historical research and archivist, basically just kind of compiling sources, and I kind of focus on the closed Lambic brewers and blenders, so that's my area.
Cool. And Matt, how long have you been in drinking Lambic and Gueuze, and kind of been infatuated with this type of beer in particular?
Kind of varies, because the first thing I remember having was a Lindemans Framboise, and I was like, oh, if that's Lambic, I don't know. So
right.
That was probably in the late 90s, but then, at some point I had a Cantillon at Map Room. I think they used to have it on tap, and I was like, oh, this blew me away. So, I don't know if that was quite 20 years ago, maybe 15, 16.
Yeah, I think probably right close to that time. My wife Margaret and I were sitting at Sheffield's.
Oh yeah.
And Matt was just there, and we were ordering a bunch of Lambic, and we ordered probably a Cantillon or something like that.
Maybe a Hansen's.
Something.
Hansen's
and you kind of inched your way over, so to speak. And you're like, oh, that's good. It's like, and then you reached into your backpack and you pulled out a wheel of Winnemere cheese. Out of Vermont, and you're like, it might go good with this, and you opened it up, which was like washed in a spontaneous beer, I believe, from Hill Farmstead at the time.
Yeah, maybe so.
And we got permission from the bartender, because they have a food license there, to allow us to eat this cheese, and then we exchanged beer advocate handles. So we were basically dating it then.
Yeah.
Officially, we were officially
we were
beer
engaged.
dating.
Yeah.
This story sounds so old. You're drinking draft Lambic at 2 bars that never have Lambic on anymore. And
Right.
You're exchanging your beer advocate.
I know.
Does that website even exist anymore?
I don't. But you used to be an admin for that site as well, where you would have to. For all the new venues in like Chicago or a certain part of Chicago, like
local.
you would actually go to them. You would like if someone like submitted a new venue to get onto Beer Advocate, Matt would go there and just make sure it wasn't somebody I don't know, just trying to use it for advertising or I don't know.
Self-promotion.
Yeah.
I mean,
That happens, too.
Untapped, you can just put your garage as a venue.
Yeah.
now.
Right. I know.
Literally, I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
They don't
No.
have that quality control anymore.
And this is the part I said I was going to embarrass Matt, but Matt also has the best palate of anyone I have ever
You've told me
met.
this.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you know of all the people we've had on the show and stuff like that. So I if anyone ever asks if I know any super tasters, I say I know at least one, and Matt is that. So
You've had the guy that literally runs the Beverage Testing Institute.
I would put him high up there. We've had Master Cicerones. We've had the owner of the Cicerone company. But in my mind, the gentleman to my left is numero uno to me. So
Glad. Good. We have a blind tasting for you now.
exactly. Which of these is?
Which of these has knockweed?
Name the denomination. Yeah. The origin of all of these, down to the region, the country, the state,
and the brew dates that went
exactly
into
the seasons.
Yeah, which seasons?
And then second is another friend of mine, Mr. Mark Linsner. Oh boy, you're just I don't know. I met you through the Chicago Beer Society, I believe, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So, and boy, I mean, I was going to say Mark is like basically Dr. Lambic, but then I forget Dr. Lambic is technically, what is the guy's name? Oh my gosh, he's listening and he's going to be upset.
Nate Nelson.
No, from California, who zooms in. He's Dr. Lambic.
The guy from Mad Fritz. Is that Dr. Lambic?
Yeah. No, not that guy. Well, never mind. Anyway.
To be clear, I'm not a doctor.
Right. Yeah. You're Professor Lambic.
Play one on podcast.
He's Professor Lambic then.
Nice.
And you have just been having kind of a hands-on relationship with Lambic for, oh boy, when did you start going to Belgium specifically to drink as much Lambic as you possibly could?
Probably about 1997, 1998, in that era. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember. So my one little story that I'll say for Mark, just to talk about his bona fides, was I remember we were at a small gathering in like the back room of West Lakeview Liquors one time when Jean Vanois was there and just kind of holding court, and Mark brought out this like dusty old bottle that I think had just like painter's tape on it with like a marker, and basically said to Jean, he was like, "This is the first bottling of Fufun. Your dad gave this to me when I visited. You were like, a young man at the time or something like that." And he was visibly impressed and excited to open it and drink it. And it was really cool to watch someone like Jean Vanois be kind of excited and somewhat in awe of something of his own brewery's history in a way. So it was really cool. So
How was the beer?
I don't remember. I think I gave it like 2 bottle caps.
So I'll say this. I would never expect Fufun to last like 20 years or 15 years or whatever it had been at that point. It was beautiful.
Nice.
Yeah.
In spite of itself. So,
But also in that setting.
yeah.
Come on. I mean,
That's the way to drink it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, if you could come up with a better Buffoon scenario, batch one with him in a small private tasting.
Probably it.
Yeah, a small private casual tasting too.
Right.
Like pretty ideal. So that's the panel we have. I think we have some good bona fides. Then we have you and me, general jackasses.
2 dopes.
Yep. And like with all these others, I'll we'll just start leading it off. And I will mention to everyone on here, don't wait to be called on. Mark, I'm glad you already said, that's not what I signed up for. Yeah, just call out whatever you want. Do not wait to be asked. Just pipe in. We'll start it out like we have with the other episodes, and I want to start with a definition of what Lambic is, and I know that maybe this beer may or may not have changed over time. So, Roel, can you just give the layperson a definition of, to you, what is Lambic and then what is Gueuze?
Well, it doesn't need to be my definition, because it has been defined by European law in 1997, when Lambic and its derived products were given some legal protection. So if I can remember this correctly, it has to be spontaneously fermented. It has to contain, or at least the malt grist has to contain something over like 30 or 40% of wheat. And then it has to be in. It has to be kept for a certain amount of time, and then you get the base product, which is Lambic, and you can then use Lambics, old Lambics, and young Lambics to blend some different beers that are also protected. So you have Gueuze, you have Faro, and you have Kriek. Kriek is the version with sour cherries. Faro is less alcoholic, and it is often sweeter. And Gueuze is the version of Lambic that is put in bottles, and that is sparkling. Mm-hmm. So probably I left something out, but that's the rough definition of what all Lambics and its derived products have to be by law.
And it's a Belgian beer, right? I think by law it must be a Belgian, brewed in Belgium to be true Lambic, right?
Well, legally, you can just brew it anywhere as long as you follow the rules. But I think we all agree that the best Lambics and the only Lambics that are really well known are from Belgium. There are a few guys in Holland doing it and making a few very nice Lambics, but I don't think they need to be mentioned further in this particular episode.
Okay.
If you ever come to Holland, try to find some and judge for yourself. But I think we all agree that Lambic it originally is from Brussels and its surrounding region, and that's still the heartland of Lambic as we know it.
Right. So you have basically a spontaneously fermented wheat beer from the Seine region of Belgium. There's some other stuff that it goes into it as well, but that's really, I think, what it is. It's an aged, spontaneous beer, and by spontaneous, well, you should talk about what spontaneous fermentation is, Mike, because you're the brewer, you're the fermentator.
It's not inoculated with some sort of yeast culture by the brewer with any intentionality. In Lambic, that usually means that, it means that they put it through a cool ship, where they put the wort they just brewed into a shallow vessel and let it cool overnight, which allows microflora from the surrounding area to fall into that, and then they transfer it out of that into barrels and such,
which are also probably heavily inoculated as well, because they've just been used again and again and again, and kind of become just a vehicle for this microflora.
Very, very difficult to completely sterilize wood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That sound good to you guys, Professor Lambic? And I won't keep calling you that, Mark.
There's also the turbid mash is part of the process.
Right. Yeah.
And unmalted wheat, I would specify too.
Yeah. Yep. Unmalted. I think those things probably go together. They go hand in hand. The need for to kind of torture the grain in order to open up those sugars. And the turbid mash being something like with the history of so many other styles that even you and I have talked about, Roel and Mike, has historical basis with, governmental, with laws and taxation and stuff like that. We don't have to get too into that right now. But something that I am wildly ignorant of is the origin of Lambic. So again, maybe you could kick it off, Roel, and then Matt and Mark, feel free to just kind of add to. Can you talk about what is known about the origin of this beer style?
Yeah. Well, the thing is that until a few years ago, there were a lot of stories about the origin of Lambic beers, and it's only since a few years that a lot of questions about the Lambic history have been cleared up, and also it has come to light that some of the stories that were floating around did not have a lot of factual basis. Also, I must stress that a few months ago, a very important book was published on the history of Lambic by a guy called Roel Mulder, who is from Brussels, if I'm not mistaken. A book's called Lambic, The Untamed Brussels Beer, Origin, Evolution and Future, which is very much recommended. Raf has been doing research about Lambic, I think, since 2014 or something like that, at least at the time he started blogging about it. Then his blog went quiet for a few years, and now suddenly there's a great book. So I may refer to this book at some point later on as well. So Lambic history, as we understand it today, is basically that it originated in Brussels in the 18th century, where it was a new beer. The spontaneous fermentation process was, as far as we know, was new at that time, at least for Brussels. And the most important feature when Faro and then later on Lambic, when it first appeared, its most important features that it was basically the heaviest beer around in Brussels or even in Belgium. That's how it came into being, and from there on it started changing somewhat. First you had Faro, which developed into sort of blend beer that you would blend from Lambic. So in the 19th century, both Lambic and Faro often were blends. There were blenders or publicans who would buy unfinished lambics and mature them further on in their barrels, then blend them to get either sweet Faro or sweet Lambic, or, well, basically the taste they wanted. And then you have the beer called Gueuze, which in the 19th century was not seen that often, but basically at that time, it turns out Gueuze was the unblended version of Lambic. So the Lambic that was kept for the longest time and it didn't need to be blended, really. That's what Gueuze was initially, but it later on, around the beginning of the 20th century, developed into the bottled beer that we know now. So then they started blending Gueuze to get this sparkling beer from bottles as we know it today. And also around the beginning of the 20th century or the end of the 19th century, that's also when we see the first Kriek Lambics appear. Blending beers with cherries had been done before, but it really got only popular then. And and that is the really, really short version of where these beers come from.
So I've a few questions, and boy, I have a few. So it's funny to me. Like I do like to talk about some of the historical, some of the stuff that as like craft beer as was becoming more of a thing, Mike, and kind of there's some in the U.S. like core readings that like so much has been based on, like when we're talking about farmhouse sales, we were talking about like the Phil Markowski book, like created that legend, and we had Roel come on and kind of slap that around a little bit. And
sorry guys.
But and there's so much the same with Lambic, but there's almost more. I think there's more of a documented history at the same time with Lambic as well. It seems so.
Yeah, it seems like less of a thing that was happening in rural, provincial environments, and more something that was from its beginnings a little bit more industrial, a little bit more codified and recorded. Yeah.
Well, I guess the first place I would want to go, is there anything that either of you would want to add to it? Because I have some questions just generally that I wanted to ask, but those are more about like, is there any truth or reality to it? I'm surprised that like basically what we think of unblended lambic now, which is this rarefied thing, is what Gueuze used to be. At least that sounds like what you were saying, Roel, which is fascinating. But is there anything that either of you would like to add? What's up, Mark?
So what I would say is this: what we think of as the Lambic family of beers today, and Roel gave the definition, that may not have been what it was 120 years ago, 100 years ago. And that's the argument he puts forth in the book, and I think he does it pretty convincingly. And you take a beer like a Cantillon Bruxelles Grand Cru 1900. In 1900, that probably would have qualified as bottled Gueuze.
Right.
And we would never call that Gueuze today. So I think it's important to know that what we think of as Lambic beers today is very different from what it may have been 100, 120 years ago. And, I'm sure there's debate to be had with the book, but I find his arguments there pretty convincing.
Yeah, the new Lambic book, which I have not read, but after talking to both of you about it, it sounds pretty. Sounds like a must read.
Borrow my copy after I'm done.
Okay, awesome.
Still reading it. I'm about 2/3 the way through.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point you made.
Yeah, and for definition reasons, quickly. So we talked about in terms of the modern definitions. You have Lambic, which we had just talked about, which is this, wheated, turbid mash, spontaneous beer from Brussels that is aged. Then you have Gueuze, which is a blend of 1, 2, and 3 year old Lambic, and then you have fruited Lambic, Creek being the one that apparently is protected, which is cherry Lambic, where they put cherries into the Lambic, but they can do it with all sorts of different fruit. And then you have Faro, which is what young Lambics old Lambic with it's young Lambic with honey added to it or some sort of sweetener.
Candy sugar sometimes.
Candy sugar, okay. Right, so that's just so for people out there who hear Faro and Lambic and Creek and stuff like that, Creek being the cherry. Is there any truth to the fact that there were cherry orchards and that the natural the spontaneous fermentation, there you go.
Nailed it.
It only took 4 times.
It's pretty good.
Had something to do with the yeast kind of coming off the fruit of the cherry trees, and maybe if there was some stuck fermentations, they'd take some of these cherries and throw them in, or something like that. Or is that just kind of fantasy, or we don't know? Like, it may be true, but there's no kind of historical reference to that.
I don't think that cherries were involved in the establishment of spontaneous fermentation, because in the 18th century, when they started fermenting spontaneously in Brussels, they weren't making a lot of Kriek. there's some documentation of some brewers using cherries, but not a lot. And you must not forget that, and Ralf Meert has shown it once more in his book, but you mustn't forget that where Lambic started out was right in the city of Brussels, and it only spread to the countryside later on. So basically, the Seine River used to flow through Brussels. If you go there today, you won't see it anymore. But the breweries that were right in the heart of the city, they were the first ones to create Faro and Lambic.
So you're saying this like romantic?
So they were not next to a cherry orchard, or something like that.
Right, because there's like a romantic story that the microflora from the orchard would waft in through the windows.
Right, from the river itself too.
Right.
I think it was like the river was vaulted in the 1860s, and like a lot of the breweries moved to the Peyottenland area, and I think that was maybe partially why it was established in that region. Still is.
What does vaulted mean?
Well, they cover up the river and like build over on top of it.
Gotcha.
So it's sort of like the water source was being shut off. So it was like a stigma that it was like a sewer, you know, open sewer.
I think it was.
Yeah, right.
I think it wasn't just a stigma.
And for another thing, they restructured the entire city. So they also just demolished an enormous amount of buildings. So also they probably demolished a lot of breweries. And the brewers just chose to go elsewhere with their brewery, where they also had more opportunity to build bigger buildings.
But I'm sorry, was I interrupting?
No, I was just going to say, and I'm the last one who'll sit here and try to talk brewing science, but I think if you got to a point where you had a lambic and it had stopped fermenting, there was nothing left fermentable. If you threw a bunch of cherries in, well, now you got some more fermentables. Sure. Now you've got yeast, whatever else is on the cherry, in addition to what was already in the lambic, and you will get further fermentation.
Mm-hmm.
But again, to get to your question, I don't think so.
Yeah. In any case, the whole thing that yeast coming from cherries, it just doesn't fit into the timeline. The adding cherries to lambic is something from the late 19th century, and Lambic and Faro were already around for over a century then.
And it is so funny that you guys talk about how this started out as like an urban style of beer, because the first time I went to Cantillon, you read these romantic tales in some of these like core curriculum books, Mike, I was talking about, and they talk about the louvers by the Cool Ship, and I went to Cantillon and I saw them, and it is in an urban area, and I saw the louvers. They were open, and I could hear like buses going by, and I was like, oh, okay, that's where the bus fumes come in. And I was like, and even to me, I was like, oh, so I guess this is what it's like now. But even then, I thought that it must have been more a farmhousey or pastoral back then. It
probably was 120 years ago, but I think that the tale of it being like literally adjacent to cherry orchards is a
farmhouse
little bit
thing,
more romantically pastoral.
Right. I think
you mustn't forget that already in the 18th century, Brussels was quite a big city. I think the biggest city in the Low Countries, and most of the breweries were right in the city center. So it was not really all that pastoral. It was really an urban environment.
And I think the jury is still out on this too. We're all nodding our heads and agreeing that yes, this came from urban Brussels, and I think everything credible you read says that. Mm-hmm. There's a big part of the lambic world that would like you to believe that pastoral, Bruegel, they're pouring jugs out in the wedding feast photo history to it, and I think there's still discussion to be had, but it seems very credibly this is a Brussels beer.
Yeah. Yeah, we have one of those paintings in our bar. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Randy Mosier assures me that's still beer. He said because if they wouldn't have money for wine, so he said it's some kind of beer, but it's probably not lambic.
Got it.
Well, for instance, in the paintings by Bruegel in the 16th century, that must have been beer. Probably some kind of white beer, multi-grain, fresh beer. Yeah.
So then, going with Lambic, was how popular was Lambic, or did it grow in popularity? Because it seems like the next time you really hear a lot about Lambic is in probably the early, what would it be, like the early 20th century, mid 20th century, when it kind of had its descendants, or I don't know. What do you say, Matt?
There was a bit of a heyday, maybe like the late 1800s into before the World War One. That was kind of like, I think, the pinnacle, maybe, where there was such a proliferation of producers.
Okay, and how many producers are we talking about, and how popular was it relative to just overall beer consumption, even in that region?
Well, in the 19th century, at least, Faro and Lambic were considered the beers of Brussels, and it was, I think, I'm not really sure at which point, but let's say halfway in the 19th century, there were no other beers produced in Brussels, or hardly any. That's it was the people's drink, especially Faro, because it was cheaper. But Faro and Lambic were basically the only beers produced there.
Okay, got it. And so what happened? Hey, here we go.
Opa.
Hello.
What are we drinking here, by the way, Mark?
This is the Driefontein and Droef Muscat Blue Batch 47, I think, of season 2021. One of my favorite beers of the last few years.
Awesome. Well,
Right.
thank you.
What makes you think I'm sharing?
Thank you. No, thank you for the description.
You got it.
Yes.
Anytime.
Yes.
Very succinct.
Yes.
I'm getting thirsty.
Okay. So then,
Thank you so much.
so what happened? So that was the heyday.
Yeah, I would say maybe I think there's estimate like 100 producers, or maybe more. And then there's this, over the 20th century, there's, especially after the wars, there was a slow decline.
And the war, just because the whole region was kind of destroyed, or
Displacement. There's supply lines being cut, and then, invading armies and things, occupying breweries and confiscating copper
world
mash tuns and things like
worlds
that.
at war. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you can see that now, how, food shortages and things like that, grains were diverted to maybe bread making and things.
Is there a reason? Because I don't know if beer specifically declined, but why did Lambic decline disproportionately to other beer at the time? And if so, why? This is an open question to any of you. I don't want to kind of assign one person to answer any of these questions. Although, Mike, you answer this one.
This wasn't good enough. Lactose came in, and the kids wanted their pastry lambics, and then
Got it.
Lindemans really took off.
Faro, the original pastry.
That's right. Yeah.
If I hear pastry again, I'm leaving.
You've reached the quota.
Welcome to the show.
Yeah, but why did Lambic decline? Well, basically because from the end of the 19th century on, you get all kinds of new modern brewing methods, foreign beer styles pouring into Belgium, and especially at some point also in Brussels, the production of lagers, of bottom fermented beers.
Competition.
And there are actually a few lager brewers that turned from Lambic to lager, or you can even see sometimes that they were producing both at the same time. But in the end, it was more modern, and in an industrial way, it was easier to produce lager.
Okay. And were they pinched at all? I know that a lot of the other Belgian styles really felt a pinch from English beer as well, and so it seems like they were feeling it from kind of north and south, or whatever.
From east and west.
East and west, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Germany's to the east and England's to the west. Well, if you look at Belgian beer just before the First World War, actually Lambic was one of the stronger beers around. But a lot of the other old Belgian beer styles, like white beers or the Saison of Liège, or Uitzet from Ghent, and all sorts of old-fashioned beer styles. They were considered weaker and of lower quality than foreign beers. So there was a lot of beer imported from the UK and from Germany. Or Belgian brewers were imitating that, also brewing British styles like pale ale and stout, or trying their hand at lager. Though lager brewing really took off after the First World War. What you see actually in the First World War is that the Germans come in and the Brussels region is not that much affected by violence or bombings, but all over Belgium, the Germans need metal, they need copper. So they take away all the brewing utensils everywhere. And after the war, a lot of brewers have to start up again, buy new equipment. They get reparation money from the Germans, and they think, what shall we do with this money? Shall I go continue brew the same beers I did before the war, or shall I buy new equipment and start brewing other beers? And that's really when lager brewing takes off, and also a lot of people switch to English style beers, and a lot of beer styles actually disappear after the First World War. We never see Saison from Liège again, or Uitzet, or some other, or Driedraad from Sint-Niklaas. A lot of beers just vanish after the First World War. Not Lambic, though Lambic is affected by it, but maybe we'll get to that.
Yeah.
And you actually see that the first real Pilsner lagers, the one everybody knows, like Stella Artois, for instance, it's from the 1920s. So that's really when Belgian brewers started brewing Pilsner, which before the First World War wasn't really a thing in Belgium.
Right.
And the Trappist too, right? I mean, that's probably the same timeline. We think of these Trappist beers as, they've been doing it. No, they've been doing it for 100 years maybe.
Right, when they say the Abbey's from like the 1600s, the beer ain't from the 1600s.
You got it.
Yeah. Well, you got actually this year, the Westmalle Double is 100 years old, which is sort of... the classic Belgian Trappist, Westmalle, is only from 1922. They did brew some beer before that, but not at the same level, not the same quality. I think in the 19th century or before the First World War, the only Trappist monastery brewing any volume that is something to speak about is Chimay. They do have some production that is worth mentioning, but apart from that, most of the Trappist brewing is really takes off after the First World War.
Yeah, and I know, and at that time they were probably, if they were rebuilding or looking to kind of change things up, they're probably looking at the more technologically advanced brewing cultures or countries, and you've got the Germans and the English, so you're going to start having Pilsners and stuff like that, and then we had Ron Pattinson on, and we were, I don't want to put any words in his mouth, but we were definitely talking about, could it be, that Orval was really heavily influenced by like Bass Pale Ale, believe it or not, and there you go, right there. And what's interesting,
that's very possible. My personal theory is, by the way, that Westmalle Double is a Scotch ale.
Yeah, I think
Like the
I've heard that
Duvel,
before, maybe from you, but
maybe it was me.
Well,
there's no proof of that, but it comes from a time when Scotch ale was really popular in Belgium. And also, I hear you talking about the Christmas beer episode, but Belgian Christmas beer is just basically Scotch ale.
Scotch ale.
Well, there's also some interesting genetic similarities in the Scotch ale yeasts and the diastatic yeasts of Belgium. That Scotch ale yeasts typically do have diastatic, like STAT1 positive genes, just not as aggressive as the Belgian ones. And so, like, there's only a handful of yeasts that actually do that. So there's some really interesting crossover that, like, those yeasts share some sort of lineage, even though they don't phenotypically seem like they would.
And even the use of invert sugar in England, and then the Belgian candy sugar in Britain.
Yep.
In Belgium. It's fascinating how when you start going back, and also it is fascinating to me that I'm just really thinking about right now for the first time is we think of lambic as the most artisanal, the most quaint, if you will, of the Belgian styles of beer, and it seems like one of the main reasons that its decline was slower in compared to the other pre-World War I styles of beer was because it was more popular. It was more industrial. It was bigger and could withstand. It had a further to fall, essentially, which is not at all, I think, what anyone would have guessed. Now, are there any writings about what the Gueuze or Lambic tasted like from this era? Like, does anyone know, or is it like porter where it's just we're kind of guessing?
I'm going to jump in on this.
Yeah, go for it.
To me, it's interesting. You read all these things, and there's quantitative stuff. They can tell you how many bushels and hectares and everything else that goes into it. They can't really tell you what it tasted like, and that's one thing. Reading the Mertz book, I'm not convinced that what we drink today as Lambic tastes that much like Lambic did 220 years ago. It may have, it may have, but I'm not convinced. And as much as I'm not a fan of things like Untapped, at
least it's a record,
right? And the case for the historians 200 years from now, if we haven't blown ourselves up, is to look through and instead of having no original source history of what does this taste like. They'll have tons of it. They just have to figure out which is somebody who knows their ass from their elbow.
Right.
I mean, that's really what it's going to come down to. Because you look at Untapped and you read what does this tell me? It tells me nothing.
Right.
99 out of 100 tell you nothing.
Right.
Future history books are like, well, there's almost no vanilla, but there might have been a lot of vanilla.
Right. It's like this one needed more vanilla. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So
more maple.
Its original source oral history is what's lacking here, and I guess that'll be a good thing going forward. There'll be plenty of it for the people that know how to tease it out, but you don't have much of a feel for what these things tasted like. And would you agree?
Well, it's also extremely hard to describe a taste. So even if today you really want to describe the taste of a beer, if you put it in words, then in 100 years' time, nobody can really be sure what you meant. There are a few descriptions of the taste of Lambic and Faro from the 19th century around, not all of them positive. So there was the French writer, Baudelaire, who said it was just urine, and that
the beer you drank twice or something.
Brussels is drinking their own urine. So that may mean that it is sour. It has a very special taste. It's just impossible to say whether how it tasted back then. I'm convinced that it must have been similar in many ways, but that's just open for interpretation.
Right, and the ingredients have changed significantly too. Like the using pale malt pre-industrial revolution would be completely different process and flavor profile from after it. Like this wind malt that we just use in a beer, which is kilned just by leaving it out in the sun and the wind, tastes completely different than malt. It tastes much more like barley, the plant does, than malt, the product. So it's like softer and greener and cucumber rather than like toasty and malty as we think of it today.
Processed. One of the things that jumped out at me in the Mertz book is how hands-on the malting and grain preparation and everything was versus today. I mean, they were doing this initially before you could, hey, I want to get XYZ from this importer or this distributor. They were doing a lot of the malting themselves. They were, there were decisions. Do we use spring grain? Do we use, spring wheat, fall wheat? How much? So there was, to me, there's a real artisanal quality to that is lost. And it has to be lost. You can't do that forever. But I think that's probably where the big differences are. A, in recipe, but then also B, in how these grains were prepared and brought to the beer.
Right. And like
and you must also forget that the hops were different.
Right.
And the amount of hops was different as well. Today they always put in old hops. But at the time, if you see 19th century descriptions, it's always fresh hops, but not just any hops, but the old Belgian hop races that today are nearly extinct, and which were different, which were not as bitter as today's hops. And probably the brewers started using old hops at some point in the 20th century to emulate the effect of the old Belgian hop races. But it probably, they must be different in some way.
So when did the is there a time where this this flavor or this designation of process, at least anyway, is kind of like firmly set? Like we're pretty sure that by this time we're starting to get to the modern process of how they're doing it? And maybe a completely different answer from a flavor standpoint. We're probably guessing this is probably at least on the same trajectory of where it's tasting now, or I mean, is it like, I don't know. I mean, you have to go way back to the who knows oral history at this point.
I don't know. Again, reading the Mertz book, what struck me is that if you go back 250 years, you really couldn't really go back 300 because it was probably before this was really starting. It was by color and by strength, right? You had in Brussels you had white beer, brown beer, and yellow beer, and Lambic was the strongest of the yellow beers. If you follow Mertz's argument, which I think is pretty credible, but beyond that, there's not much to it. I mean, it was about how it was taxed and how what you had to pay to brew it, basically. There's nothing that said you had to all brew it the same way. You would obviously try to do it the most efficient way, and they learned a lot empirically, but there wasn't a ton of science behind this, right? They just knew that if you did these certain things, and what's interesting if you read the book is that he almost says spontaneous fermentation is a way to, you're lengthening the fermentation, so you're going to get more out of it, right? It's going to give you a clean beer, and it's going to keep fermenting when a normal yeast wouldn't.
Right.
So not that, that they necessarily knew that, but they knew it empirically.
Sure. They knew.
That was probably their purpose, and it has been probably the purpose of Lambic for a long time to create a heavy beer. Which you can do by using these yeasts that just have a high degree of attenuation.
That's also an interesting thing to think about is the effect of Brettanomyces on these beers too, because Brettanomyces is thought of as a wild yeast, but it's actually incredibly hard to capture in like pastoral environments. Like if you do a wild capture of something, you might get something that tastes like you think Brettanomyces is in it, but it's very, very likely that's just some sort of wild Saccharomyces making that flavor. Brettanomyces pretty much is only found in breweries, wineries, and for some reason, goat farms. So it's like a cat. That description of it being like a cat is like it almost self-domesticated, where it exists in these breweries, these wineries, is something that like symbiotic to when you want it to the environment, but it's not something that like is everywhere or outperforms any other yeast. Usually, even if it exists in a mixed culture or something like that, it gets outperformed by the wild Saccharomyces before it can even consume any of the sugar you think it's going to consume.
So it's funny. So in these environments where you're letting it sit on a sugar source for years, like where in the wild would you have that? So maybe that is why it's self-domesticated, because...
Which also could lead to the fact, this is completely anecdotal, just in my head, that over time, Brettanomyces had more and more of effect on the flavor for it existing in those barrels and accumulating over time. That's definitely not proven, but you're not capturing as much of it just coming in through the windows, and so it's not like you're getting a new pitch of bread every time. It has to outsurvive.
Well, if you think about, I read another book recently, which has come out a few years ago, which is the book by Lars Garsol. About farm brewing, and he basically says the same thing, that if you look at the yeast used in those Norwegian farms, the only thing you find is Saccharomyces. The normal beer yeast, and you almost never find anything else. And he also says in a farm environment, that's the yeast that survives the easiest, and it's more in a brewery environment that you can get all these other yeast that they manage to survive there.
Yeah.
And I was also struck by the ease with which those farmers can keep their yeast. So it's so easy to store yeast that not to use yeast in a brew is a very conscious decision by for instance, the brewers of Brussels, that they really consciously said we're not going to use to add yeast for this brew because we find out that for this beer it works better not to.
Do we think that was a flavor choice, or is it more likely it was a financial choice, not having to keep the yeast going in a brewery or doing something like that? Do we have any reason why they would have made that choice?
I think that it's a flavor choice, but flavor in the sense of if we use this spontaneous fermentation process, they empirically found out that if they did it this way, they discovered that in the 18th century in Brussels, then we get very alcoholic beer. Then we get a beer that is very much attenuated, that has a lot of alcohol in it.
I think
and that's probably why they did it.
I think you can look to Britain too, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, British fungus, that's what Brettanomyces is, and they didn't really know what it was, but those big stouts, they like that winey flavor in them. They like that, that leathery Brett flavor. And, same kind of thing. I think you didn't do it consciously, but empirically you knew when you liked the way it tasted, let's keep doing this.
Mm-hmm. So let me move along a little bit. So we have kind of decline of historical Belgian styles overall, Lambic being one of them, but Lambics maybe being in a better position to hold off for longer. Was there then a resurgence at all? I don't want to talk too much about it. I want to kind of get to the more modern times quickly, but I do want to see, did it go up or if not, if it was just a steady decline, when did it reach kind of its lowest point? You want to take this, Matt, for a little bit?
For the lowest point, I would say probably the 70s or so. I don't know, 80s.
Okay. And it was just little by little, just attrition, just one would
like
close, one would
mergers
close.
and acquisitions, I would say. It's like some of the larger industrial breweries were buying up all the smaller ones and consolidating them. Mm-hmm. There's a few, not just like one doing it all, but I think the worst offender was Bellevue. Mm-hmm. And then there was a few other conglomerates. There was Brasserie Uni, which was like 6 different smaller producers, and they kept their names, but they basically bought them out and, used their breweries for other, producing other beers. But they were all Lambic breweries at the time. I mean, it's still, a market for it, but it was, that increased the decline.
And was there an existential threat for Lambic? Because I remember when I was reading about it, when I was first getting into it, it certainly was written that way. And again, anyone kind of jump, you nodded your head, Mark, like there was a real existential a fear of this style of going away. What's your thoughts on that?
It's tricky, right? I think there was an existential threat that good Lambic would go away, right? I think we could have ended up with the commercial crap that has really very little to do with spontaneous fermentation, oak aging, the influence of
Very briefly, give me your off-the-top definition of commercial crap for someone out there who really may not know.
Sweetened, pasteurized. If you want to look to the products, and I'm not saying this in a negative way, to me, Lindemans is always sort of the gateway product. It was the first Lambic I ever had. There's nothing wrong with it. Roel has one there on the video.
It's a nice one.
There's nothing wrong with that in a... Well, now I'm never going to be able to go to Cantillon again now that I've said that, if they listen to this. But it's a different product, right? It's sweetened. It has very little to do with what Lambic is. When you drink a Lindemans Creek, it may be a good drink, but you don't necessarily see what the core of what Lambic is. So I think that would have survived no matter what. I think that was probably pretty safe. Bellevue, some of the places in West Flanders that are doing it, Jacobin, I think it would have been safe in that sense. But I think existentially, had Cantillon or Driefonteinen gone under, had Frank Bone not taken the interest he took when he took it, I think that, yes, there was an existential threat to real Lambic.
Got it.
The industrial
Yeah,
side of it also.
probably Bellevue would have still been around, but you were mentioning Lindemans, but there are worse offenders
Right.
out there.
I only singled them out, Roel, because that's what we can get here. I mean, for most of us, that was the gateway Lambic. I don't mean to pick on them. They're super nice people. They can make good beer. But I'm just saying that I think the Creek, the Framboise, all those things they do, those were probably pretty safe.
I would say to if you talked to 100 people, you might have to talk to 500 people really. Of the ones who knew what Lambic was, I would say of the people who knew it, 90+% of them would think Lindemans in the United States. So I think you're very fair in your kind of using that as your kind of benchmark here. Well, you were going to say something,
Just
Matt?
defining like the industrial lambic, versus traditional. There's a lot of cost-cutting measures that really cut down the time frame. Where you're not aging for, 1 to 3 years, or maybe 6 months, and then they're maybe throwing some oak chips in there and not even putting in a barrel. They're forcing compressed air into their tanks, and they're not using a cool ship at all. So something like that.
And that was happening now, or was, or
Well, certain breweries don't allow the public to
that's very Belgian.
insider
That's
to
a very
document,
Belgian thing. Yeah.
It's been documented in certain books.
Got
So
it.
except for some of the new breweries that have opened in the last 10 years, or blenders, I would say there's not a brewer that didn't have some flirtation with forced carbonation and or sweetening, including Cantillon, including Driefonteinen. And I think they were very wise in that they had people who told them don't do this, or their own conscience told them don't do this. But Cantillon, for a brief period in the mid 70s, and they're open about it, they did some sweetening, they did forced carbonation, and this is when the business almost died, right?
It's a survival technique.
Exactly. And if you look at the history of Driefonteinen, there's a whole, and I'm going to kill these Dutch pronunciations, I apologize. Herman Tierlink was one of the thinkers of Belgium, and he would meet at the Café Driefonteinen, and they would play cards and talk politics. It was kind of like the Algonquin round table kind of thing. And when Armand's father started to do some kegging, not kegging, but forced carbonating and some of these things, he pled with them to stop. And he said, there's places, Van Halen nearby, that's closing, and they have equipment and this and that. And he said, so Herman Tierlink said, don't do this, stop it. And Driefonteinen stopped it. But I think there was this push to say there's nobody right now, unless they've opened in the last 5 years, that hasn't flirted,
No one who lived
flirted
through
in
it.
some way. You
Right.
got it. You got it. And the two that I think are the best had a very brief flirtation and realized this is not this is not us. This isn't going to succeed.
Cheers, guys.
Oh, cheers.
Oh yeah, and they've got some now.
With
Hey,
some Lindemans,
cheers.
no less.
In the traditional glass too. Cheers.
Yeah. Well, and I would have to add to that I think Lindemans isn't that bad, but in the 60s and 70s there were a few brewers out there that were really going industrial, especially Bellevue in Brussels, which is today owned by InBev, by the way. But they were really industrializing the whole thing and sweetening it and pasteurizing it and putting it in crown cord bottles and whatever. And another one was Van Holsbroek in I think Eastern Flanders. Who were really industrializing it, and at some point they had I suppose 90% of the market or something like that. And in comparison to that, Lindemans has always remained a relatively small producer. And if we didn't have this, let's say, renaissance of interest for traditional lambic, I think the ones that would only be around today would be probably Bellevue and Saint Louis.
Yeah, right.
In their most industrialized incarnation.
And if anyone were, I would say, if there wasn't this reincarnation of it, resurrection of it, I should say, I don't think it's absurd to say that the only classic Gueuze being made could potentially be Cuvée Rene, because the others would have gone under, and then that's kind of their special nod to tradition. I could see it kind of an alternate universe kind of going that way, and they've always made it. They've always had that kind of nod to tradition. So I've got no, certainly no hate for Lindemans, and I don't think you do either, Mark. In fact, I know you don't. I know you don't.
No, just to clarify,
yeah.
Again, like I said, super nice people.
No, but I think you're just being realistic to what the U.S. market is right now.
And when you talk about,
do you guys get more Subit in the US?
Not much.
Not really.
They're some
Very hard to
cakes
find.
came-
Also, one that is more on the industrialized side of the spectrum. It's also owned by Heineken, by the way.
Yeah.
Well, and to back up a second, too, you talk about Lindemans, and I think when you talk about why are we having this in America, and I think that's probably where you wanted to go with some of this. We have it because of Merchant to Van, right? I mean, Chuck Finkel and his wife, I mean, they were the ones who saw these things. They read the Jackson books and said, let's get this stuff to the U.S. So Lindemans is critical in the history of all this. And in Cuvée Rene, again, I don't want to tell history I don't know, but I think that was pretty much Chuck Finkel saying, where's this traditional stuff I read about in the Jackson book? And I think that's kind of where Cuvée Rene came from, was sort of a request from Finkel. Could be all fake, news, but I'm pretty sure that's kind of how that happened.
That's amazing. So along those lines, so Lambic was not in the best place. You did have Michael Jackson, who I know you are a strong believer in, Mark, really kicked off the craft beer renaissance, or really was a huge facilitator of it, let's say. As big as anyone. Like we talk about the Papazians, we talk about the Grossmans and the Maytags and stuff like that, but you would put him right up there, right?
Ask those three where they got their inspiration, right?
Right.
I think all three of them would probably give you the same answer, reading Michael Jackson and his books. And, if you would argue that this stuff, again, I don't think it would have died completely, but if you argue that this wouldn't have had the resurgence if it wasn't for American interest, and that's a whole argument, right? Jackson
I would have to add something to that. That I think it's the influence that Michael Jackson had is quite clear. But there was already something moving in Belgium before his book came out. You already had Pierre Celis reviving Hoegaarde white beer in the 1960s, which everybody said in his village in Hoegaarde, he said he was crazy reviving this old beer, but he found a market for it. And another thing is that, for instance, with Lambic, is that in 1970 there was an article written by a guy called Marcel Fransens, who was, I think, a city tour guide in the city of Halle and near Lambic, who wrote a piece about how Lambic was a historical witness, and that it had a great historical background, and it promoting the beer and its history. And unfortunately, Mr. Fransens got a lot of the history wrong. But in hindsight, that's only fortunate, because it did help Lambic regaining some popularity also as something of historical or traditional or even tourist value already in Belgium at that point. So there were already a few movements in Belgium towards some interest for traditional beers. And Michael Jackson's book did help. For instance, well, as I have it here, the Dutch translation of his book came out the same year, and it was really popular over here in Holland and Belgium. And inspired by that, 2 years later, there was another book written by Wilfried Patroons, a book simply called Beer, which described all the Belgian breweries that were around then for the general public. And you got a really sort of interest of which Michael Jackson really was a part. But there was more going on in Belgium even before that. And in at some level.
Sure. So, but for the English-speaking market, I think it seems pretty clear, and also may have. I mean, again, this is hot take history. So, I mean, who knows? Some of these, importers may have traveled over to see some of these like wonderful beers that they're reading about. That I remember you, Mark, just telling me how you would read about these beers and then go traveling great distances just because there was I heard they're getting Courage Stout in. I read about this beer. They're getting it in. I've never had it. I've never had an Imperial Stout in my life. I've never had
What a
one.
world.
They're getting one in, and I'm going to travel to get some because I heard a rumor some might be coming in. And it was all because of this writing. And I think it was because people were bringing, so some of these importers were coming. And I know Don Feinberg was instrumental into that. He brought Bone Lambic in, and first brought in, or first visited and first approached Cantillon about coming into the United States as well. Frank Bone maybe suggested, asked. That maybe 2 Lambic breweries in the book might be too much, so to not sign with Cantillon, and then the Sheltons kind of swooped in and grabbed Cantillon afterwards, and at least that's the story I've heard from people
So
close to the.
for a little historical reference, and this is like having lived through it, you could get Lindemann's in the late 80s in the United States if you went to a good liquor store.
Mm-hmm.
Shortly after that, you could get De Troc and Timmermans and Bone and Van Berger Wolf. Absolutely, tremendous part of all this. The Shelton stuff came later. And what they did was great. But there were at least 4 of these you could get in the U.S., and I don't know who was bringing in the Timmermans or the De Troc, and they were bringing in all the sweetened fruit stuff. But you could find this in better places. Mm-hmm. So and that was sort of the introduction, was these very sweet commercial industrial product.
Right. And then you started getting the more traditional stuff coming in, and is it fair to say? I mean, and let me ask. I'm pretty sure it's fair to say, with the 4 Americans sitting around the table. But Roel, do you think it's fair to say that the export market and the U.S. being the largest part of that, so is all part of this a fair statement, were huge in this most recent renaissance of Lambic?
Yeah, I find it hard to say, but then it would just be you would need to look at the numbers. I know that quite a few Lambic brewers do a lot of exports, and if you look at the Belgian beer scene as a whole, I think over 50% of all Belgian beers goes abroad. And it is true for a lot of small brewers especially. So if it weren't for exports, a lot of breweries would not be around anymore, or a lot of new ones wouldn't be around.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do think that exports did help financially, and probably also just for their self-awareness, their self-esteem. People in the world find our beer interesting, so it must mean something. And also in Belgium itself, there was a renewed interest in it. And if today you go to a thing like Tour de Gueuze or another event, you see a lot of young people enjoying lambics, while in the 1970s it was really an old people's drink. So it also has a huge folling, luckily, in Belgium itself.
Yeah, well, increased sales have a tendency to boost interest in things generally, which is good. So I am going to shift gears a little bit. I'm going to start being a little bit more focused on the domestic market, and then Roel, I would love for some context whenever you have it, and I take it back for any of you for what maybe the European market was going through at the same time. But so now we have craft beer is and different types of beer is really becoming of interest. Now, you were mentioning Mark Lindemans and Saint Louis and Beaune, de Troc, Timmermans. Sorry. So all of those are back sweetened. Do you remember who was started to bring in the real traditional lambics? And what brewery and when about that would have been?
So that's where Shelton kind of comes into the picture. I will say this. Van Berg de Wolf did bring in some of the traditional Beaune stuff, the original black labels, those sorts of things. The Mariage Parfait was originally Creek and Framboise, and then but also Gueuze. And I think they say that black label, the new Beaune black labels, they say are extensions of those original. And it was a tartar, drier beer. And I don't want to market for them, but I think that's what they would tell you. Those were probably the earliest traditional. Beaune and then Cantillon. And then probably Hansen's, Driefonteinen were the next ones that were, really traditional stuff. Girardin slipped in somewhere around there, but really it would be the traditional Beaune stuff and the Cantillon were the first stuff I ever saw.
Right. And
probably early 90-ish.
And then that stuff was just at some point it was there, and then at some point it wasn't there anymore. I mean, this stuff became like the first unobtainium in beer that I can remember. Like, I don't remember a style of beer from certain producers becoming more hallowed in U.S. craft beer circles than Lambic and Gueuze from Cantillon and Drie became. First Cantillon and then Drie. And then it kind of simmered. It went out to a few others, but it was like I've never seen anything like it. It was like the Pappy, like it was there and then it wasn't there.
I slept through this, okay? And what I mean by that is there was a point where I had a friend saying, I'd love to try Cantillon St. Lamvinus. And I said, well, I'll go get you one. I can find one for you, because I would go to good liquor stores.
Yeah.
And I suddenly realized, holy cow, you can't get this anywhere. This is unobtainium all of a sudden. Ron Extract from Jester King and from the
Garden Path.
Garden.
Yeah.
Super great guy. He was working for Binny's at one point back in probably the late 90s, early 2000s. I went to one of the stores and I said, "Do you have all those Cantillons up on the top of the shelf?" And they were totally dusty. They would sit there forever. Places would sell it on clearance. I know this sounds unbelievable right now. And I said to Ron, "Aren't you worried about those getting skunked up there?" And he's like, "Dude, it's Lambic. It's not going to get skunked." And I'm like, "Oh, that's a good." But that argument, that conversation tells you how slow this stuff was to move and how it literally was like a switch flipped. And I missed it. I mean, I didn't realize that at some point this went to be the unobtainable. And I don't know when
it was in like 1 year. Matt, do you have any idea why that may have happened? I mean, because you were deep into that culture at the time that this thing kind of flipped.
I think initially it was like the price point of it was higher than anything else, and maybe that's why it's set on the shelves. But I think there was some online discussions and hype behind it that drove that kind of sudden
like
sales and things.
Beer Advocate or talk, like what was the
Rate Beer. I think there's a lot of forums that maybe promoted.
And then you could go to Cantillon, you could see it, you could see how it was not like anything that anyone had ever been to yet in a big city, so you didn't have to go to a small town or to the countryside.
I think there was just no replacement level version of it, right? American breweries at the time were making imperial stouts already, at least in some quantity. They were making probably IPA. They were making everything else. Some were making like Belgian beers. But no one had made that. No one had made lambic. So you couldn't go to your local brewery, or you couldn't find a local version or find a domestic version. So when it was gone, it was gone. And as we were talking about, it takes 3 years. It's like bourbon. So at
least 3 years, if not 4.
Right.
I mean, it really takes probably closer to 4 years. So because I remember there was a big deal when Allagash put in their Cool Ship, and they were going to make, I think, their attempt to make the first traditional Gueuze in the United States, style Gueuze. And then you forgot about it, and then 4 years almost later, it came out. So it's like Yeah, and it's also very shelf stable, which helped it, I think, greatly. I think all that probably played into it, but it was
And they just
fantastic how it just went
make
away.
that much beer. Like they didn't make that much beer then. Like
Yeah.
how
I have-
big was their production?
I have Lambic in my cellar that has clearance stickers on it. Cantillon Iris from 2003.
Yeah.
That a wine store in Milwaukee just couldn't sell, so I bought them for $3, right? And it turns out they were the 2,000 bottles and bottlings, and I've had them since, and they're the most brilliant beer you'll ever taste. But it just at some point in that window. I don't know when the flip switch, and it wasn't that I wasn't into Lambic. I was buying it, drinking it. I just wasn't necessarily drinking the stuff that I was buying at the store. It was stuff I'd
Right.
buy back, and it just it's like overnight it became, like you said, unobtainium.
What year are we talking here? Like
What about
2009,
the,
2011?
Yeah, a little earlier, maybe 6 or 7. I don't know.
What's up, Roel?
what about the other Lambic brewers? How easy are they to come by in the United States?
So it started out with Cantillon, and then it went to Dree, and for a while, both of them were impossible to get. And then Hansen's you could always kind of get. Jardin has become more and more difficult to get. Bone has been this up and down ride, very odd. Tilken is starting now to be just on the shelves fairly regularly for year round. But that was initially difficult. They were also the first of the new school, or if you want to call it. We'll get into that shortly. I think I've covered probably most of them.
Jacom.
Oh, yeah. Oh, shoot. Yeah, I mean, you can't get that. No, you can't get that. Lindemans, though. Lindemans you could get. Even Cuvée Rene. That was one of the ones you could find. But Cantillon still, you cannot find it on shelves.
I have not
And do
seen
you
one.
guys ever get Gueuze on draft, on barrel?
Yes, from Jacom.
Yeah, no. He's joking. He's joking.
Well, Tilken.
I'm sorry, Carl. Don't take that personally.
No, we get Bone and Tilken.
Tilken.
That's it. Yeah, the end of story. Now, for very, very, very special occasions, you'll get Cantillon. You'll get it for Swansea, but that's essentially it, unless you are that one place in Washington, D.C. that's has relationships to the Sheltons. Then you can maybe find some stuff in D.C. But really, other than that, it's really, really difficult. So there was then this mystique over it, and we'll talk about how that mystique had kind of filtered out to the rest of beer. But I do think, well, no, let's talk about it, because I do know that we had talked about. We'll talk about the resurgence afterwards. That'll kind of be this latest resurgence and what it has meant in the domestic market and all these blenders and all this stuff like that. Do you have a corkscrew on you by chance? No? Okay.
Grab one at the bar.
Nah, okay. And
I'll go grab it.
yeah, you go
have
grab
better
it. You
information to
stay
give
here,
than me.
Mark. So actually, no, Mike, you stay. You stay for this. Yeah, you stay, because I want to talk about how the domestic market was affected overall by Lambic, and I also think Saison. We talked about this rule last time as well. I think that I don't know, I hate to use this term, but the vibe of this whole thing had a huge impact on these beers. I mean, in U.S. Craft beer, I think all of these, anything that says artisanal ales, any brewery in the USA that ends with artisanal ales, I think is directly influenced by Lambic and Saison,
Right.
and probably really closer to Lambic, honestly.
I mean, I think
It had a huge cultural impact in the craft beer world here in the U.S.
I'm probably one of the few that has a Saison brew more influenced by what I would consider Saison, like DuPont and the Blaugy, than Lambic. But most of those guys want to make something akin to what Lambic or like the most transcendent bottles of Fantôme tasted like, and that's like
Totally.
the goal. And like the first of that would be Jolly Pumpkin, right? That wanted to make this not necessarily spontaneous, but quote unquote wild influenced, tart, funky beer as like their mainstay and their flagship. And I think when we talk about the romanticism, like that place has a lot to do with the American conceptualization of how romantic
What
these
place?
beers are. Jolly Pumpkin.
Jolly Pumpkin.
Because that's Ron Jeffries is a guy who's like, well, basically he's like, only my palate can make these beers. And that's like one of those things where it's like, that is the anti-industrial vibe. But yeah, pretty much any brew with artisanal ales or that makes saison, that focuses on saison or has a mixed culture program, wants to make something akin to Lambic and is probably inspired directly by Lambic and indirectly by Jolly Pumpkin, which I think is
Right.
yeah.
And I think then you have these breweries that for there was a few years in U.S. brewing where those were the coolest,
Right.
most authentic, realist breweries until they found out that it was that famous story. It's like how the cow tipped over the lamp, and that's how the Great Fire started. I mean, that's how the pastry stout started. Like somebody accidentally dropped their beer into the frozen yogurt mix-ins, toppings.
Like, hey, this is pretty good.
Yeah, and that's how everything turned away from artisanal ale here in the United States.
Right. I think it also has to do with not being able to make a lot of money doing it.
No, I'm joking.
Turnaround times.
Yes. But it is funny. Like, was there ever this mystique, this just a crazy hype in Europe for these styles of beer? I do remember at its height of just not being able to get any of this stuff, going to England and still seeing it kind of there and on draft and stuff like that, and was just kind of floored by it. It was still considered pretty special, but people weren't as special. Like, there was no line to get it. You could just like go to these places and find it. I was floored by it. I was looking around like, wait, do you guys not know what's going on here? And then they served it to us in like shaker pints.
Until recent years where you see the mules lining up at the beer thing to get stuff, you didn't encounter that sort of thing. And Roel, I mean, he's there, he can speak to it, but I don't think the sitting online stuff. It may be coming to Europe now. It may be coming to the Netherlands and Belgium, but it was never there that I saw.
It's very much culturally American too.
Yeah.
The commodification of these things is completely different.
Well, over here in Europe, you see that it is really different in which country you look. So if we just limit this to Belgium and the Netherlands, well, especially here in the Netherlands, you do get a lot of trends that come in from the US, like IPAs and imperial stouts and now pastry stouts and New England IPAs and all that sort of stuff. Belgium is much slower at adopting all that. And basically, so very often just the craze also goes away, and Belgium just plainly ignores it. But at the same time, for instance, here in Holland, there's not really a craze going on for this kind of wild spontaneous fermentation. You do get a few people making wonderful spontaneously fermented stuff. Some of them call it Lambic or they call it Gueuze, others don't, and they just produce wonderful wild beers and very creative, but it really is a niche market. So there are a few people that make some Dutch unobtainium. Try coming to Holland and try finding a bottle made by Tommy Chef. Very hard to find because it's just great stuff. It's just one guy basically making it in his garage, and it's absolutely fascinating stuff. But it's not really that big, and perhaps also because it's quite easy to obtain the original stuff. I mean, in terms of availability of Gueuze and Lambic here in Holland, it has only gotten better. It's I think it's hard to get a Cantillon here, or well, it's not easy to get it cheap. But last year I was pleasantly surprised that my local supermarket had Boon. The Gueuze Boon. I got this Lindermans from another supermarket. If you go to a good liquor store, you can get Drie Fonteinen or other stuff. And for some of the other stuff, you just drive to the Belgian border, which is half an hour's drive away from here, and you buy as much Girardin or the Cam as you want. And maybe for the Cantillon, you just drive 1 hour and a half and you're in Brussels. So so you don't really have what they call in economics. They call it they have a name for that. Is when locals start producing something that is hard to obtain from foreign countries, but import substitution. But you don't really get that here because you have the original thing, which maybe is an impediment on innovation, because you don't get that much people here in Holland making lambics. But you can get the real thing.
And most recently, Mark, you were talking about how there's this explosion in brewers and blenders. Can you just talk a little bit about the origins of that and where we're at right now?
So, I mean, I think it's hard to pin down the origins of it, right? But if you look at Lambic from the modern sense, it starts with de Cam in 1997 or whatever year it was that he reopened. And it was, to be clear, it was Willem van Herwegen, and I'm sure I murdered that name. Apologies to the Dutch, but it was him and Armand de Belder from Drie Fonteinen, and they helped finance this. And it was in the Peyottenland Cultural Center. And there was a young guy who was a brewer at Witkap Potter. I can't think of the name.
Okay. Yep.
The brewery in Ninove. Anyway, doesn't matter.
Slagmelder.
Slagmelder. It was Karel Godot, and he was involved with it. And ultimately, he's taken it over as the years have gone on, and it from very early in. So that was the first one. I mean, that was where people were saying, "Holy cow!" We went from 1993, where we thought this thing was as good as dead, till now there's a new one. And then there's a little bit longer, but then you start to see ones. And I think what you've seen is you have places where they have a brewery on top of it, right? So
and we have not mentioned that at all. So there is a long history of brewers and blenders as well. Can you just break that down a little bit? Because we haven't touched on that at all.
We haven't. So in the Mertz book, he talks about the beer preparer, and I'm not sure how that fits into all this, but in modern times, you've had the places that don't brew their own, and Tilcan is one of those until last year.
Yeah.
Hansen's is one. De Cam is one.
Drie was one, right?
Drie was one. Lambic Fabrique has been one and is one again. And I think, so the idea here is that they're buying the Lambic from places.
Multiple places often, right?
In general.
And when we say buying the Lambic, at what point do they bring it in-house?
From what I've seen and what I know, they get it as soon as it's made. I mean,
Right.
fresh wort.
Essentially buying wort, right?
Yeah.
They're not like this kind of whiskey producers now. They're buying finished barrels and then just blending them and saying, look at what we did. We're 3 years old. We have a 15-year blend.
No, and maybe 200 years ago that was something they were doing, or 150 years ago. But in modern times, you tell Frank Bone, brew me this wort, and the truck comes around and you fill your barrels.
It goes into their barrels
2 days later or whatever it is after it's been, so that's what the blenders are. And, somebody at the beer temple asked me, one of the guys at the checkout said, do you think it's better to be a blender or just a brewer that uses your own stuff? And the answer is, I don't know, right? Logic would tell you if you're a blender and you have all these different things you can draw from, you could make a more interesting or varied product. But some of the best lambics I've ever had, the best Gueuze I've ever had, come from one producer, right? The Armand 4, the Armand 4 season series.
Yeah.
Those are the best Gueuze, in my opinion, probably ever ever made in recent times. And
Since the 1800s, you've had them all.
those were some of the best Gueuze ever made, and it was all with his lambic. So, I don't know what the answer is, but, there's certainly a difference to that. And so, Chris, I think there's a couple things that are happening now. One of them is you've got using Lambic Fabrique again. They don't have a brewery anymore. They're not affiliated with Gueuze, not Bellevue, Gueuze, the way they were. But they're going to Driefontein when their wort is produced, and they're brewing it at Driefontein and with the Driefontein brewer. So it's a much more hands-on kind of blending, and I think places are doing that. And I think the other thing you're seeing is you have established breweries that are trying to segregate this. And Lambic is so clean now versus 30 years ago, you don't have to separate it as much. I'll just say that everybody was worried, you have all these wild yeast. They're so clean now compared to when I started to go visit them. It's a lot easier to have the wild fermentation next to the standard solid.
That's also a lot of education to the brewers about what these yeasts actually do and what their the ability to kill them is. Like people were like, Brett gets in there, it's going to be in there forever. It's like, actually, no, it's as easy to kill as anything else. You just have to have the right procedures.
Right, and so now if I'm running a brewery and I'm making regular beers, it's a lot easier to have that 3-year wait before I produce a Gueuze. And guess what? You don't have to produce a Gueuze. The first beer we had here was the Brussels Beer Project, not weed, invasive, not weed, Lambic. That's a new place that's attached to an existing brewery. And I think their model is going to be very different. They're going to look at this and say, I don't necessarily want to wait 3 years before I'm selling this Lambic that I'm making. I'd rather do fresher things, and who knows what they're going to do.
Sure.
But so far, they've released a lot of stuff with fresh beer. It makes you wonder if they have any old beer, that they're leaving to age. But that's how I think this is changing. And from an historic standpoint, we were talking before the call. There's like 27 Lambic producers right now in varying degrees. And Matt and I were trying to say, when was the last time in Pajottenland in Belgium you had 27 or 28 Lambic producers? You probably got to go back to maybe the 50s? Early 60s, maybe? Roel might have an answer.
I think so, yeah.
So I mean, this is a renaissance time.
Right.
What's up, Roel?
It sure is. The whole fact that people are brewing again out of nowhere, that's really fascinating, even at a small scale. But it's a very fortunate development, and at the same time, in the past it happened quite a lot that new Lambic breweries were established. So it's technically it's apparently not even that hard or impossible. It's a very special skill making lambics, but it is possible to establish new lambic breweries because it in the past it happened a lot. They even had lambic breweries over here in Holland in the 19th century. Don't know what they taste like, but they had some degree of ongoing production. And you also mentioned that they make lambics in a brewery where they also make other beers, and that in the past happened a lot. So
oh, really? Okay.
We may assume that also in the past they knew what they were doing, because you would even have breweries that would have made lagers and Gueuze in the same company. I'm not sure it was in the same room, but it did happen a lot. So apparently, if you do it the right way, then it's not impossible to have various forms of fermentation inside your brewery.
And I think to that point, a lot of the places, you'll say, well, this brewery's from this, we can use Lindemans or De Troc or even Morzabit. Those are old breweries for the most part. They may not have been lambic producers when they started. They may have made lambic type things, but they were probably producing whatever the beer of the day was. And at some point, they started to specialize. But at to Roel's point,
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of time the assumption is to think that people didn't know, and that's why they did it. Not that they knew they couldn't maybe quantify it the same way we do now, or didn't have the same technologies to separate stuff. But I mean, they knew inherently what was going on, and that's fascinating that you
Right.
have like a lager and a lambic brewery
and
in the
some
same
of,
company.
Some of the specialized equipment that we think is so unique to Lambic was not really unique to Lambic when those breweries were being founded. Like the Cool Ship was something that was used by many breweries to cool their
Sure.
water that weren't
By
trying
all of them.
that weren't trying to make spontaneously fermented beers. And same with large barrel fermentation. That wasn't necessarily a thing that was happening in wild, quote unquote, wild or spontaneous breweries uniquely. So it's very likely and believable that these breweries were just set up to make whatever the beer of the day was, and then it just happened that this was the flavor that was in fashion.
Yeah.
You must forget, for instance, that cool ships were used by all breweries
Right.
Until the late 19th century.
And they were wooden.
In a lot of ways, Lambic is not different from other beers from the past. For instance, the use of other grains than barley, or the use of cool ships, or the use of wooden barrels. Of a lot of that stuff just was going on for all beers.
Right. It's one of the few that
but-
still does that
A
exclusively,
holdover in a way.
and one that we know the story of, right?
That's awesome. So now for the true hot takery, because now you can't rely on anything. So where do we see Lambic going? I mean, I think we have plenty of traditional. We still have some other stuff. There you go. Look at that.
go.
That right there. That's a man who's seen a lively bottle open before. He was not at all taken by surprise on that one. Not a drop spilled.
It's a pro. Well, I think, I don't know about Lambic specifically, but to speak to American, I guess, for lack of a better term, sour beer or mixed culture production, there's the line certainly that happened where with intentionality, where the early like American sour beers were accidents, and so at some point people were like at their brew pub, it got infected, and like, oh no, they do this in Belgium. It's a Flanders Red now. Then at some point with the Jolly Pumpkins and other things, they became very intentional, and we've grown from there. So, what is this? This is great. Sorry, I got distracted.
Let me talk about the future.
Yeah.
There it is. Rhubarb?
Sorry, I lost my train of thought. This beer smells awesome.
I've never tasted a lambic. Well, I mean, it's very interesting. Anyway, yeah, I could.
Yes.
It's interesting. You would say that, Mike. The intentionality. I do think that sour beer in the U.S. has reached non-quick sour,
Right. Let's put kettle sour aside.
Yeah,
not for
kettle
any,
sour
not for any
aside.
value judgment. Before it is a very different thing than what we're talking about.
and also I think owes a lot to the Belgian lambics and the Flanders Reds and stuff like that. Like their ascendance is a faster,
Berliner.
easier, a quicker way to get to that, like to scratch that itch, so to speak,
Right.
And lends itself to fruit and stuff like that. But because of that, these more labor-intensive, expensive types of beer being produced in the U.S. I don't know if they've reached the bottom. I tend to think that they have just recently passed the very bottom. So there's still, it could crash, but I think it's starting to level out. But I mean, holy cow, it's just been a complete decimation of U.S. A sour beer interest, and I mean that U.S. produced sour beer. I mean all these breweries that were just the coolest of the cool kids on the block are now. I mean, all right. So the Guard, I have nothing but great things to say about them. I've been there. I was blown away. I've talked about my visit here and how just amazed I was by the whole place. I never expected to see their beer in Chicago. We just got our first drop this week of the Guard. So like that tells me something.
Sure, but there's like I don't know how to put this the correct way, but there's some sort of fatal flaw in the conception of a lot of the way those breweries were perceived, and I'm not sure how much of it was their doing and how much of it was just the nature of them making something good and unique and in small quantities, that if your brand is synonymous with that unobtainium we were talking about before, once it becomes and in people's minds, if you haven't had a lot of those beers, it's a bigger percentage of it is being unobtainable than it is being a great thing that you enjoy drinking. That once it is obtainable, some of that mystique and some of the drive is not as big. So
it was going to be like, well, we're going to be the Cantillon of the United States.
Well,
and someone else is going to be the Cantillon of the United States.
I want to make sure that, like, I'm not saying that any of these breweries necessarily did that as an intentional marketing scheme. Some may have.
Some may.
But the fact that definitely is applied to a lot of these small, artisanal mixed culture beers, that they lie directly in opposition in the ethos to scale and production, because those things just don't align quite the way that we hope that we would like them to as small producers of things.
Right.
But so some of that has to do with the lack of the falling away of attention, and some of it has to do with the fact that there's just so many beers, like in all categories, that when someone
they got hurt as bad as I think any other popular style. Like you can say Amber Ale got destroyed, but it was already on its way down. One that has just like it was supposed to be like they were a Super Bowl ad of craft beer. Like in the craft beer Super Bowl, like there was one year where American Wild Ale was like all over the commercials that year. Like when I went to CBC, like there was like cool ships for sale and stuff like that.
Sure.
So you know how like the Super Bowl ads are kind of the zeitgeist of like what people think are going to be the next like kind of big things or the next push that companies are trying to do. And there was crypto, but I think there was a while where U.S. sour beer was going to be it was going to be those beers and IPAs and imperial stouts.
Right.
Like it was going to be those three, and one of those three has just fell off a cliff.
Well, the first things it has the most. The smallest production, the most challenging flavors relative to that production, right? IPA bitterness is challenging, but it's everywhere. When I was working at West Lakeview, we talk always about this life cycle of the beer, the new beer consumer, the new craft beer consumer. They would come in and they would probably be like, I had Daisy Cutter or Gumball Head or something like that, and I want to get into this. They'd go Pale Ale, IPA, Imperial IPA, and then they'd be like, oh, what's this Dark Lore? They get into like stouts, Imperial stouts, barrel-aged stouts, and then it would get into the Belgian things, and then Lambic was kind of all the way around this cycle until people got back to being like, you know what I really love? I really love a good, well-made lager. But it was all the way around the cycle where you have to like explore flavors and different avenues of bitterness and sweetness and challenging flavors and simple things. But always Lambic seemed to be at the end of that life cycle. And as craft beer grew and more consumers came to it, more people started putting out more beer at the beginning of that life cycle that was pleasing enough to people that they never kept going down that journey. Maybe it's a fallacy that everyone would go through that entire journey of trying all these styles and that everyone was into it for like exploration alone. But Lambic being as challenging, as unobtainable, and as weird as it is in the story is like kind of a thing where people that got into beer later, like 2015, 2016, 2017, there were 6,000 breweries and they were all making IPAs, and so many of those breweries then met them where their palates were rather than them having to seek out newer things.
And that life cycle is now been altered because all those beers don't exist anymore to do that challenge. You go in now, and for a while it was IPAs, sours, and stouts, and you would say like, I'm buying something for my partner. What do they like? IPA, sours, and stouts. Right. Like that's what they would say.
And you could get all of those. It couldn't be like, well, we've tried all these, so let's try this thing now. And so whereas the producers of American Wild and sour beer went through that whole trip and were like, obviously the consumer coming behind me is going to get here eventually. It just didn't happen.
Well, you know what?
So that's a huge part of it.
What cut them off at the pass was kettle souring and that kind of stuff. Take those
shortcut.
Yeah, you got it, and I think it may have derailed the journey for some people.
Yeah. And just like a good amount of people not needing to explore to try something. There's a new label on it, and it's got Citra, Simcoe, and Mosaic instead of Mosaic, Citra, and Simcoe. That's like enough newness for a lot of people.
Right.
Or
this Citra Mosaic Simcoe is from that brewery instead of this brewery. They're from brewery X instead of brewery XY.
Right.
And it's like, well, now X, yeah. So they're just finding these little ways to make it slightly different. But I do, unless you have something super important, I wanted to talk about if anyone else had any ideas of where this type of sour beer is going. Matt, any idea? Any predictions?
For
any
future of
hot
Lambic?
takes?
I mean, there's a lot of experimentation more now than ever, I would say. I mean, the Japanese weed beer was a good example of that. I mean, I've never heard of that until today. So, there's a lot of, wine grapes seem to be
we have
a hot
big
trend.
Tilken event, and they've been doing a ton with wine grapes, and some of them have just been absolutely fantastic.
And maybe that'll tap into a new market, and it's more accessible to wine drinkers. I don't know. I mean, my dad's a big wine drinker, and I always try to present Lambic, and he's like, "Oh, this is pretty harsh. I don't know." So, but maybe there's something that's balanced enough that he could go for.
I think if the Belgian Lambic world is smart, there'll be a little bit of a reconciliation here, right? And everybody who's held on to these, the Bruegel paintings, and this is 600 years old and all that stuff, maybe it doesn't matter. As somebody who loves the history of it and enjoys it, I'd like to know the truth. I'd like to know what really happened. But really what matters is what you're drinking in the glass. And as someone who's been drinking this now for 30 years, it's a better time now to drink Lambic than there's ever been.
Wow.
Things that we took, then, we said, it's dirty. The barrels have to be full of, have crap all over them and spider webs. Yeah, I think we get it now that you don't.
Right. If you've been to Tilken, the place is spotless.
Almost all of them are now.
You could eat off the floor of that place.
Yeah, and they're all getting to that point. And I'm not saying there's not cobwebs and dirty barrels, but that's much less the mythos of it. So I think that whole kind of the whole peasant dance theory, let's call it that, it doesn't matter. Let's find it out. The people that are interested in the history, let's be interested in it. But there's so much good Lambic to have. And as Matt said, I think, we were drinking beers here while we were talking. One of them was the Drauf Muscat Bleu from Driefonteinen.
Unbelievably good, by the way.
Beautiful beer. And, you look at what Continental's doing. You look what so many of the new places are doing. This intersection of wine and beer. And that's what Lambic always was, right? Michael Jackson said, intersection of wine and beer. At its best, of the best drinks on earth. At the worst, they're still fascinating. So I think you're going to see much more of the wine influence in Lambic, for good or for bad. But you're going to see.
In what ways do you mean that? Like just with using grapes, or do you mean it in other ways too?
Largely with the grapes, but I think that whole minimal intervention kind of a thing you're going to see. And we had two beers here from Boerenhof Eilenbosch. One of them a rhubarb, which is another trend. You'll see tons of those. I mean, they seem to be popping up everywhere. Mm-hmm. But it's this, the Kestemont, which is the old Gueuze, is another new one. These places are coming up, and a lot of them are on or adjacent to fruit farms, and I don't even know that they're going to produce Gueuze. They're buying Lambic, and they're putting fruit in it. And I think you're going to see a lot of this. I mean, the numbers, just to watch them explode, it's really interesting. And this is a boom time. And looking at these places, you don't get into this lightly. Right, you don't take the family farm and clean out all the barns and buy wooden barrels. You don't do that lightly. So you're doing that with a plan for the future, and you have whatever the history is. You've got the recent knowledge. And Boerenhof Eilenbosch, these are the disciples of Armand de Belder. God rest him, great guy. These people learned to do this from him, just as he learned from his father, and down the road. So there's a mixture of history and tradition. But I think the sky's a limit in terms of what you're going to see in Lambic.
Great.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that for a long time Lambic only had a past. Yep. It was always really looking back at a greater past where it was supposed to be really big, and now it's also looking forward. And sometimes that means that they try new things. I do hope that they also stick to make more of the same, because it's just wonderful. I don't think it needs grapes or rhubarb or whatever. But it's fun to try. And it has a future again. It's growing again, and that's just wonderful. And just now we were talking about, before we were talking about, does it still taste the same as in the 19th century or in the 18th century? No one knows, but it's an ongoing tradition. That there has been no point in history when there was no lambic. Everybody who has been producing lambic and Gueuze and Faro and Kriek always had an idea in his mind of what it should be like, because all these people making Gueuze and lambic, they already are aware of tradition, how it can taste, how it perhaps in their mind should taste, and that's what they work from. It's an uninterrupted tradition going back 300 years, and maybe it tastes different today than it did 100 or 200 years ago, but it's all the same tradition. No one has ever stopped making lambic.
Well put. That's awesome. Well, I think we've that's all there is to say about lambic. Nothing else. If you went to Lambic.info, I don't think there's any more information you could possibly get than
You
what
should
we
check
just,
it out, though.
Oh, it's an amazing. I think it's an amazing site.
Go to it every day, get those clicks up.
Yep, exactly.
No calls to action, but it's a good thing. I'll be doing that.
Yes. Yeah, Lambic.info is definitely a reference point that I've used for all sorts of random stuff like lambic related. Even when I'm like trying to find like old like decorations and stuff to like put up on the wall, like, okay, what search term should I use? And I'll go to probably some sites,
Authentic
some of the pages.
decorations for bar.
Right, exactly. Probably some sites that you pages that you curated, Matt. Like,
Maybe.
okay, what are some of these old ones that are defunct? And let me start doing some search terms for them and find some old, signs. And then I'm like, oh, Michael Roper already bought that one. Okay. Is there anything else that anyone would like to say before we get out of here? I certainly want to thank all my guests, but is there anything you guys would like to say?
I think Roel said it perfectly when he said this has always been a beer that was about the past, and now more so than ever, or more so than we know, it's about the future. I think that's...
And Roel, can you just mention your blog to everyone, if you wouldn't mind?
Don't forget to check out lostbeers.com.
Yeah, I was on there I was looking up I was on there for the Christmas beer episode, actually, trying to look up some old stuff. I saw the Scotch Ale stuff, and we mentioned that on the episode. So yeah, another great site. So thank you much for that, Lambic.info. And if you ever see Mark Linsner, ask him to tell you what maybe his favorite lambics are in order for each year. For I don't know how far back could they hypothetically go, Mark, that you would have a definitive opinion on, and maybe 25 years. Yeah. Have you been is that how long you've been keeping track?
Close to it. I mean,
Yeah.
I've been, you talk about...
I've seen some information, and it's pretty comprehensive. It's pretty amazing.
Very extensive.
You talk
Yes.
about original source, yeah. 25 years.
That's awesome. So if you ever see Mark, be like, hey, Mark, what was your 7th favorite lambic in 2009? And they'll be like, give me like 30 seconds, and then he'll let you know. Well, thank you guys. This was absolutely amazing. Thanks for all your expertise. Thanks to Roel, to Matt, and to Mark, and obviously to Mike. Anything you want to say? There's one more thing we do have to say collectively before we leave.
Next episode is the book club, right?
Yes.
So if you have questions for Josh Knoll about his book, Barely
Well,
Stout,
two episodes, I think, from now, right? It's the 22nd.
it's
It's the 13th today. I remember because I said it when we opened, and I messed up and I had to start over.
I'm unstuck in time.
Very soon.
But if you have any questions for him, send them to What
Insiders.
Insiders at Beer Temple.
Craft Beer Temple.
So
Let me
just
say it. Insiders at craftbeertemple.com.
tweet them
Show notes.
into the abyss at some sort of verified account. They'll
Yeah.
get here.
Yeah, exactly.
Or mail them to.
Yeah, the Beer Temple, 3173 North Elston Avenue, Chicago, Illinois, 60618. I think we got another. So we've got people interested in this barrel-aged stout and selling out book club episode that we're going to be doing soon too. Thanks as always. I'm glad I finally got this one in the can. I've been wanting to do this Lambic episode, partially because I knew that Matt and Mark might just bust some stuff out. Go dig into the crate, so to speak.
This is a selfish episode that you want to drink some.
Exactly.
Some
Oh my
cool
gosh, the
Lambic.
sun is now going to blind me. All right,
I
guys.
was using your head to block
Yes.
it.
Well, thank you all so much, and we will see you next time. So long.
Good to meet you, Roel.
This is what we wanted. Remember, this is what we said. To never be heard, seen from again. Remember, this is what we wanted. Remember, this is what we said. To never be heard, seen from again. Remember, this is what we wanted. Remember, this is what we said. To never be heard.